This is our 43rd episode, the era of the remake and reboot. While reboots are a somewhat modern invention, Hollywood has been making remakes and reboots for quite a while. The very first one was the 1903 film, The Great Train Robbery. It was remade the very next year in 1904, and not with the same imagination as today's remakes. In fact, from what I've read, it's almost exactly the same movie. The same shots, story, everything. What's worse is that the guy who made the remake didn't even have permission to do so. But filmmakers in the early 20th century did not have the benefit of our modern copyright laws. At least with modern remakes, they try to change things up a little or show stuff that wasn't seen in the original films. Some say that that they make these remakes because Hollywood is just flat out running out of material, but I disagree. Despite our complaining and whining about remakes and reboots, we like the idea of seeing things a little differently and experiencing our favorite characters in a new way. What is my proof, you ask? Well, beyond the popularity of such comics as Elseworlds and shows like What If, showing us new visions of our beloved characters. Put simply, we all support these remakes and reboots by seeing these movies and buying the films. But I will say this: while Hollywood has been doing remakes and reboots for a while, there seems to be a lot more reimaginings and remakes and reboots than ever before. It's like we've entered the era of the remake and reboot, and that's what we're here to talk about today.
Definitely. Now, I admit that I generally have mixed feelings when it comes to remakes, reboots, and reimaginings. I think when people say they're tired of remakes, I think they're usually talking about specific kinds of remakes that have been done in recent years. Most people will roll their eyes at the idea of remaking classics like Back to the Future or The Princess Bride with good reason. I mean, you're not going to do it better than those movies did.
Good call. I mean, there are definitely some films that are considered both perfect and impossible to do better than the original, and those two are some great examples. I might add Ghostbusters to that list, though.
Oh, I would as well, which is why I tend to stick to the first one. I get why people are tired of Disney and live action remakes too, especially when the original animated features are so hard to top. But there have also been remakes that have done well, and in some cases even improved on the originals. We're in a time when it seems like Hollywood will remake virtually anything, so we're bound to kind of get both kinds in that mix. So why don't we get into specifics?
That sounds like a great idea. But first, let's talk about definitions. What exactly is the difference between a remake and a reboot? While a sequel is a continuation of a story, remakes and reboots are a different animal entirely. Remakes are often much like the original films in content and in spirit, but they have some modernizing of special effects and some slight adjustments to them. But remakes do have one rule. There must be a shared continuity between them, a core of details that must be adhered to, or it becomes a reboot. Whereas a reboot can basically do whatever they want. But we'll get into that a bit more in our reboots discussion. A couple of prime examples of what a proper remake is are the two 1933 King Kong remakes that came out in 1976 and 2005. I know you've got some things to say about those remakes, Steve.
Oh, indeed, I do. King Kong is one of those films that makes sense to remake it, at least as we've seen it done here. I think part of the issue with remakes is that some studios don't know how long to leave the franchise alone. With King Kong, though, the character was left alone for decades, long enough to build demand and for the right creators to come along. Sometimes a character or a series needs time to simmer before it can catch on again.
That's very true. There has to be a need for it, and that requires both nostalgia and an advancement in technology. I know I've certainly looked back on a few movies and wish they could be remade with modern special effects, and I think that has to occur for the time to be ripe, as you said.
Right. The original King Kong from 1933 was an iconic film, and it made a huge mark in terms of monster movies. King Kong may be the first time that we've seen a giant monster look convincing and even threatening on screen the way that one did. It's also one of the first times we've seen the misunderstood monster really take hold, along with a Boris Karloff version of Frankenstein. On the other hand, there are definite areas where this movie could have been made better. Keeping in mind that this was 1933, And because of that, there are many instances of overt sexism and racism in this movie that would never be tolerated in modern film, and understandably so. This movie constantly puts down the Fay Ray character in openly sexist ways, in addition to treating her as a damsel in distress. In addition, the treatment of the natives on Skull Island also gets pretty cringy and problematic. All of this is in addition to improving the visual effects and storytelling quality of the original film, which was very much a film of its time. There was definitely room to build on here.
Special effects are a big incentive for remakes. Advancements in technology are happening all the time, and that's one thing that can almost always be improved upon. As far as the racism and sexism go, it is really baffling to consider what was once socially acceptable behavior, even back then. To modern eyes and ears, those things seem so obviously wrong. Fixing those things was definitely something that needed to be improved upon, especially by 1976.
Yeah, agreed. The 1976 version, I think, is better in some respects, but it didn't exactly stand out in a memorable way. To be fair, though, I think the cast in this one is great. You have Jeff Bridges, Jessica Lange, Charles Grodin, and Renee Auberjonois, best known to Trekkies in our audience as Constable Odo from DS9. They changed the story quite a bit, though, focusing on Bridges as a paleontologist who stows away on the ship headed to Skull Island. Definitely, it was a lot less cringy and offensive, and the effects are better. But while it's perfectly fine, it's just not that memorable. I'd honestly forgotten that this movie existed until I found it on HBO Max not long ago.
Yeah. I can see that. I think that I'd also like to add that I think the 1976 film, it really stretches the boundaries, really, of what a remake is. It kind of borders on reboot territory, in my opinion.
Yeah, true. That one straddles the line, I think. Where we start getting really good Kong films, though, is in the early 20th century or the early 21st century, and that was a proper remake. When Peter Jackson took on King Kong in 2005, he was fresh off Lord of the Rings, and he was the hottest thing in Hollywood at that time. He probably could have taken any project he wanted at that time. But King Kong hadn't been done in 30 years by then, and it was a good time to bring it back. Jackson was able to give Kong a more modern take while keeping it a period piece and having it remain true to the basic story of 1933. Kong has always been the classic misunderstood monster, and the core of that is in this version of the film. At the same time, the human characters have more depth, and the drama surrounding them is more interesting. A cast including Adrian Brody, who, as an aside, I wish had been cast as the Shadow, Naomi Watts, and Jack Black in a serious role give more depth to the story. I also have to say Jack Black surprised me given how good he is in this film. He brings an almost Orson Welles vibe to his performance as Carl Denham, and it's great.
Oh, totally agreed. I'm a big fan of Jack Black. I loved his appearance on X-Files and Tenacious D. But while School of Rock is my favorite Jack Black film, Black's most impressive role by far is Carl Denham. He really showed the range of his acting chops in this film. I got to say, I took him seriously after that.
Yeah, I did as well. It shows what a good comedic actor can do in a serious role. But while some things are the same, I'd say the more modern storytelling, the acting depth, and the visual effects makes the 2000s Kong a very different film from the 1933 version. But what exactly goes into creating a good remake, and how far can you stretch it?
Well, remakes are often done by a new director that has a new vision or interpretation, or even a reimagining for the highly respected core material. You know, the established continuity. But in truth, what that core material is can make the original. What that core material is can make the original film and the remake a lot different. What I mean is this: sometimes the shared core material between the movies is not the previous film, but rather a book or books that it all came from. In that case, a film qualifies as a remake because of the shared established continuity, i.e., the books, but can still go in a new direction and still be a remake rather than a reboot. A great example of this kind of remake, I gotta say, is It Chapters 1 and 2 from 2017 and 2019. both the original television miniseries from 1990 and the two films, of course, drew from the same material, Stephen King's 1986 horror novel classic by the same name. This means that the core material for both is exactly the same, but there is a different interpretation of the core material and different constraints on both. The miniseries focuses almost exclusively on the characters as adults, with flashbacks of their childhood, and the films thoroughly explore both time periods. My favorite part of it is the parts dealing with the Losers Club as kids, and that's why it Part One is got to be my favorite of the two films. Comparatively, I also prefer the cast of the children in the films over the miniseries. I just felt their performances more than the cast of the original. Finn Wolfhard as Richie, Jaden Martell as Bill, Sophia Lillis as Beverly, which she did a great job. Jack Dylan Grazer as Eddie, Jeremy Ray Taylor as Ben, Chosen Jacobs as Mike, and Wyatt Olive as Stanley. They just are the losers to me. To be fair, I imagine the limits and censorship of television in the 1990s had a lot to do with what was covered and what wasn't. But still, both the miniseries and the films cover many of the same scenes. But they're redone in the films to include modern effects without the same restrictions that TV had in the 90s because it was a film with the R rating. But the key difference between them is the perception of the Pennywise character. The 1990s miniseries, with Curry's influence, portrays Pennywise as a clown choosing to be a monster, whereas the film, with Skarsgård's influence, show him as a monster choosing to be a clown, which I think more accurately reflects the book.
Now, I haven't seen all of either film, but from what I have seen, all of that sounds about right. Stephen King adaptations often tend to be troubled. Hollywood likes King's novels because they tend to work on a visual level, but they also tend to make a lot of changes, and not all of them work. I agree that censorship and length probably were issues in the case of the original It. Redoing it after 30 years in two separate films probably was the best way to go with it. And I doubt King was entirely happy with the original miniseries turned out either, so it's just as well. This really is a case where I think time made a better remake viable. Not that I think the original was necessarily bad, just that something better became more doable, much like with Dune. Doubly so with modern effects and fewer restrictions on what could be produced.
Yeah, that's a good synopsis. I'm gonna have to agree with that. What's another good example like It, of two movies that were taken from the same source book that turned out differently and improved upon the original?
There's the example of True Grit. True Grit is an interesting case of two successful films coming out of the same source material. Now, both were based off the 1968 novel by Charles Portis, with both versions receiving honors. Now, while it's not my favorite John Wayne Western, the original True Grit is a perfectly good film. And Wayne's portrayal of Rooster Cogburn got him his only Oscar in his long career. It also boasted a very strong cast, including Robert Duvall, Dennis Hopper, Glenn Campbell, Kim Darby, and Wilford Brimley. Yes, that Wilford Brimley. The 2010 version of the Coen brothers, though, plays much less like a Wayne-style film and much more like a modern Western, playing a bit closer to the novel. The cast in that movie is stellar as well, with Jeff Bridges as Rooster, along with Matt Damon and Josh Brolin as the film's villain. The remake also began the career of Haley Steinfeld, who played Maddie Ross in the 2010 version. Unfortunately, unlike the original, the remake didn't win any of the Academy Awards, even though it was nominated for quite a few. It racked up an impressive 10 Academy Award nominations, including Best Director, Best Picture, Best Actor for Jeff Bridges, Best Actress for Haley Steinfeld, and Best Adapted Screenplay. And honestly, I'd be more inclined to watch the 2010 version, much as I have a fondness for John Wayne. I feel like the Coen brothers made much more serious Western, and one that I think respects the novel quite well. But unlike some remakes, I don't think either version is bad, and it's arguable that the Coens improved on what was there before, which to me should be the point of any good remake.
That is very true. I have to say that I'm far from an expert on westerns, especially if you're talking about John Wayne. I was always more of a Clint Eastwood guy when it comes to westerns. I mean, with the exception of HBO series Deadwood, which was amazeballs. But while I can't compare the 2010 film to the original. Having not seen the film, I will say that despite the lack of Clint Eastwood, I enjoyed True Grit. I think I just prefer a more serious and darker tone to my westerns.
That definitely makes sense to me. While I lean lighter and softer on some things, I like a certain edge when it comes to westerns as well. Actually, Wayne could occasionally get pretty dark in some of his other films. The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance and The Searchers give a glimpse of how dark he could be when given the right material. But I feel like it was Sergio Leone and Eastwood that opened the door to the kind of western that we got in the 2010 True Grit remake. But as much as I could talk westerns all day, there are other great remakes out there. Are there any that stand out to you, Mike?
Oh yeah, some of my favorite remakes of all time have to include the 2004 remake of Dawn of the Dead. With all due respect to Tom Savini, who did an outstanding job of practical special effects for his day, I just flat out think the 2004 film did it better. I also love 2009's Friday the 13th. It was a great modernized retelling of parts 1 and 2 of the original film with a new story. Um, Gotta bring up 2013's Evil Dead. That was just awesome. Bruce Campbell will always be Ash, and he does a great job for the Evil Dead 2 and Army of Darkness and Ash versus Evil Dead. But I found the darker, more serious take on virtually the same material much more satisfying. Lastly, I got to mention the 2006 remake of Casino Royale, which is my favorite Bond movie. Again, I appreciated the darker and more serious tone of the film, and I love Craig as Bond.
Oh yeah, I do as well. Those are some really great choices, and I agree on the last three especially. Now, while I prefer Bruce Campbell as Ash, and I likewise loved him in Ash versus Evil Dead and the Evil Drug trilogy, the 2013 Evil Dead was far better than I expected it to be, and it works very well for what it is. I have no problems with that. I think, though, my own favorite remakes would include the 2002 version of Count of Monte Cristo starring Jim Caviezel, John Carpenter's version of The Thing from 1982, Bram Stoker's Dracula from 1992, and Hitchcock's 1955 version of The Man Who Knew Too Much. For those of you who are unaware, Hitchcock had actually remade his own film from 1934, and it is great.
I wonder how many people do that, remake their own films. I don't recall ever hearing about that before, but I can definitely get on board with that list. Especially as it concerns The Thing and Bram Stoker's Dracula. Love those movies. But let's get into our discussion about reboots. Reboots are quite different from remakes, and they're actually a relatively new phenomenon as far as film history is concerned. Reboots are often made many years after the original film, sometimes decades. That's something reboots and remakes often have in common. And that is time between films. Reboots also have new casts and an approach to the film in general. With a reboot, the creators take elements or even just an idea or premise from the already established continuity, often ignoring any conflicting previous continuity, and go in a whole other new direction, often transforming them to reflect modern technology, audiences, or just to freshen up the story and attract new fans. A great example of a reboot would be the 2010 film The Karate Kid, which took a vague concept from the 1984 classic. A kid moves to a new place and is bullied, but learns martial arts from an Asian master to defend himself. And it turned it on its head by making it about a kid named Dre Parker, not Daniel LaRusso, who lives in Detroit, not Newark, and moves to Beijing, China, instead of Reseda, Los Angeles. Quite a bit different than just moving to a different state. And he learns Chinese kung fu and not the Japanese karate, which begs the question: why call it the Karate Kid at all? However, I did like the film, and I appreciated a lot of what they did to change up the story. But I think had they not used the name The Karate Kid, I might have liked it a little more. Jackie Chan was great in that. In fact, one of my favorite lines of all time came from him, and that is, "There's a big difference between sitting still and doing nothing." I also like Jaden Smith as an actor. I thought he played his character really well and did a good job with the choreography. Like I said, for all intents and purposes, I liked the film, but it is tainted by that name, and it's a complete departure from the source material. In my opinion, the original Karate Kid was so good because of Daniel LaRusso and Mr. Miyagi.
Yeah, that's a good assessment of it. Like you, I think I'm less against the idea itself and more that they attach the Karate Kid name to it. I certainly don't have a problem with Jackie Chan, Jaden Smith, or the two of them doing a martial arts film together. It just ain't the Karate Kid, no matter how often Jackie Chan catches flies with chopsticks. Um, Now, after watching the 2010 Karate Kid, I began to wonder if this was a case where it was less a remake and more an original script that was molded into the guise of a reboot. I feel like the plot elements and certain lines from the original Karate Kid were bolted on to a completely different film. For one, the movie doesn't even involve karate as a discipline. It's about a Detroit kid who goes to China and learns kung fu. Some elements are the same. Dre is bullied like Daniel Russo was, and he had to learn martial arts to stand up for himself. But it's also a movie about a kid fitting into a completely different culture in a different country, which Daniel never had to deal with until the second film. What the movie does is really fascinating with good wushu action scenes, and it's a great look into Chinese culture, but it's just not the Karate Kid. The Kung Fu Kid probably would have been a more accurate title and would have established its own identity better.
You know what? I actually said the exact same thing after I first watched it. And I will add, as someone who has taken both karate and kung fu, not only are they nothing alike, wushu practitioners would not be all that happy about being associated with a Japanese martial art and vice versa. Calling it the Kung Fu Kid would have made it so that it didn't anger Karate Kid fans or insult two distinct cultures. I think had they done that, I might even own the 2010 film.
Yeah, very much so. They really screwed up with that. I think that this may be a case where the established identity of the original just gets in the way of embracing the new story being offered. And that can happen sometimes. A perfectly good idea can face resistance because it's taking the name of a firmly established brand. But at least we have the original series back in the form of Cobra Kai, so the two versions can coexist quite well today.
That is some comfort. I will give you that. But let's switch gears here and talk a bit about our favorite reboots. My favorite reboots of all time is a longer list than my favorite remakes. One of the best reboots in the horror genre, in my opinion, is the 2003 film The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, directed by Marcus Nispel. The original 1974 film was just unwatchable to me. I couldn't get past 50 minutes into the film, and I wanted to butcher Franklin. Uh, he might be the most annoying and frustrating character in cinema history. Also, the Sawyer family in the first film was just not understandable to me. They were just white dress nut jobs. However, in 2003 film, which focuses on the Hewitt family, it's so much more understandable. I mean, don't get me wrong. The Hewitts are some broken, twisted people, especially the sheriff. But I could see how they got there with the town basically closing down. I mean, desperation and starvation can make humans cross all kinds of lines. The characters were also more endearing to me in the 2003 film. And Andrew Briniarski was a way better Leatherface, in my opinion. Plus, the 2003 film didn't pull all of its punches like the 1974 film. I like to see that little extra gore, and they put it in there. And I also enjoyed the story in general a lot better.
Yeah, that's an interesting reaction. Now, I was able to stick out the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and while I think we look at it a little bit differently, I totally get why you saw it the way you did. You're right that this movie is difficult to get through in the first hour, and like you, I hated Franklin. I was so glad when he died. I also think that this group of teenagers is incredibly dumb, and they end up getting killed due to their own stupidity. But the second hour actually does get better, at which point it goes into sheer insanity. By the time we actually see Leatherface and his screwed up family, it's hard to look away from the film in a train wreck sort of way. And watching Franklin finally die is so satisfying after how irritating he's been throughout the entire movie. But I will give this movie points for authenticity. As someone who's lived half my life down there, the setting looks and feels like Texas, even if it's this bizarre nightmare version of rural Texas. All in all, though, this movie may be one of the craziest and most messed up films I've ever seen. But I think the reboot is a valid idea here, as I think it can definitely be improved upon. As to how well it did that, I have mixed feelings about the 2003 reboot, but there's a lot I like about it. Except for Jessica Biel as Erin, I didn't really like most of the kids in this version either, but at least we didn't get anyone as bad as Franklin here. They were a little bit better in the reboot. And I didn't get the sim feeling like this was Texas as I did with the original, though. The movie was clearly filmed elsewhere. But I agree that this movie doesn't pull punches, especially with the girl who kills herself in the van. I like that they changed that character from the original, as the guy in the 1973 version was so creepy that I didn't find the kids picking him up to be believable in the slightest. But while I like the new Leatherface in this film as well, he really wasn't my favorite villain. To be honest, Arlie Ermey as the sheriff was far and away the best thing in this movie. Although Ermey gets typecast as Marines, he could be a really great actor when he sinks his teeth into a role. And man, do we see that in Texas Chainsaw Massacre. In the 2003 reboot, he comes off as a complete psychopath who abuses his power as the sheriff to torture these people in the van. He goes from funny to scary, and sometimes both at the same time. And a lot of that is Ermey's performance. He's just so much fun to watch, and I think this may be my favorite Ermey role that he did since Full Metal Jacket. He's just that good in this film. Any other reboots come to mind for you that were better than the original?
Yeah, I have a couple actually, but first I want to say that you were right about the sheriff being the real evil in the film, and it was 100% because of Ermey's performance. This is amplified all the more by the sequel, The Beginning, but that's a tale for another time. Another big favorite reboot for me was actually the 30th film in the franchise. I'm talking about 2014's Godzilla. That movie that launched a whole new universe of monster movies called the Monsterverse. I would like to note a couple of things about the original 1954 Godzilla film and its 1956 Japanese remake, Godzilla King of Monsters. These movies, despite their almost identical names, are almost nothing like the 2014 film Godzilla or the 2019 film Godzilla King of the Monsters. But some of the basics, and what I consider really the most important parts of the Godzilla mythos remain intact, even if the stories and the films are completely different in the rebooted universe. One major difference is the oxygen destroyer weapon used to kill Godzilla at the end of the original films. It destroyed all of the oxygen molecules in the water and turned what remained into an acid that ate Godzilla clear to his bones. But the 2014 film does, I believe, give a nod to this in that Monarch discovers a skeleton from the creature very similar to Godzilla. But let's get into the mythos a little. The basic premise of the 54 and 56 films is this: that there is an ancient sea creature, a dinosaur-like monster or kaiju named Godzilla that is living dormant in an unexplored undersea pockets. This creature is awoken by the radioactive energy of the repeated H-bomb tests in the Pacific. The originals also suggested that Godzilla had evolved from a sea creature to a land creature as a reason for him leaving the sea. In Legendary's Monsterverse, Godzilla is very much a sea creature and a land creature. He is able to move about and function in the sea as if it's Godzilla's native land. But he can definitely get around on land too. Also, Godzilla is awoken by nuclear bomb testing instead of H-bomb testing. But either way, the radiation plays a big part in what awakens Godzilla. The origin and basis for Godzilla has had its boundaries stretched and manipulated many times over the years to include many adaptations over its 29 preceding films. Any Godzilla fan can tell you that Legendary is not the first to take some liberties with the franchise. Sometimes Godzilla is a protagonist, here to save us from terrible monsters, and sometimes he's the antagonist, attacking and destroying everything. However, in many versions, it does appear to be, I can talk. Does appear to be us that often provokes Godzilla's attacks. But the 2014 reboot film finds Godzilla falling somewhere in the middle, leaning more towards his attacks being defensive in action, and his fights being him fulfilling really his role as one of humanity's protectors. Also, as a side note, In the 1954 film, a professor, I hope I'm saying this, Kioi Yamane, suggests that a team be put together to deal with not just threats like Godzilla, but also other creature cases like the Yeti. This is important in Legendary's MonsterVerse. There's such an organization called Monarch, which I loved. One thing is for certain, though. I love the special effects of the new movies. They are just awesome. But my favorite of the rebooted franchise has to be the 2019 film Godzilla King of the Monsters. That movie was just amazing from start to finish and had some truly awesome fight scenes in it. It also made me a big Mothra fan, but I'm not the only fan of this new franchise, am I, Steve?
No, this is a pretty good time to be a kaiju fan, especially with the recent films. I remember a lot of people being excited for the recent Godzilla film, so you're definitely not alone. Now, I'm a bit weird in that I never really got into the kaiju craze. It was just something I never grew up with, and so I don't have a deep attachment to it. So I haven't seen too much of the new Godzilla films, unfortunately, but I will admit that you have to respect a giant lizard who can breathe nuclear fire at you. The monsters are definitely inventive, and they've gotten bigger and more ambitious now that the special effects have made these huge monster epics possible. But finally, it's worth bringing up Kong Skull Island when talking about monster movie reboots. It has absolutely nothing to do with the earlier Kong remakes, which mainly focus on the trip to Skull Island to make a movie and the hilarities that ensue. We have none of that in Kong Skull Island. This is a movie set during the 70s, and it's basically a riff on Apocalypse Now, except with monsters. That actually is a fair take, since Apocalypse Now is itself a riff on Conrad's novel, The Heart of Darkness. Samuel L. Jackson basically plays the Kurtz character, who goes crazier and bloodthirstier in his quest to destroy Kong. He's one of the best things in this movie, and the movie raises the question of who the true monster is, him or Kong. The answer for me is clearly Jackson, whose hatred of Kong reaches suicidal levels. Kong, in contrast, is presented as the guardian of Skull Island, who is keeping the peace against a much nastier threat on the island. Now, if you're an MCU fan, you'll see a lot of familiar faces in this film, too. In addition to Jackson, you also get a pre-Captain Marvel Brie Larson, Tom Hiddleston, and even John C. Reilly in a memorable but minor role. Both of the last two Kong films are perfectly good takes on the idea, with one as a good adaptation of the original, and the second as a looser but fun take with a great high concept. I think it helps that Kong isn't redone that often, giving us time for us to miss it and the right filmmakers to do the right movies, as it was with Skull Island.
I love Kong Skull Island. I have already watched it more times than all three of the King Kong movies that preceded it. And again, the subject of time is a factor in the enjoyment of the reboot. It seems like somewhere around 20 years apart seems to be the baseline, but some of them are double that, like your next reboot pick. Why don't you tell us a bit about Ocean's 11, Steve?
Sure, I'd be glad to. There are very few things in common between the original 1960 film and the Steven Soderbergh remake from 2001, so we're talking 4-year gap here. The original was a vehicle for Frank Sinatra and his Rat Pack, and while the reboot centered more on a lot of Hollywood up-and-comers from the early 2000s like George Clooney, Brad Pitt, and Matt Damon, aside from the fact that the main character is named Danny Ocean, that Ocean is a criminal genius in both versions, and the fact that it's 11 guys pulling a heist, they are completely different films. The two groups are very different. The original 11 were a group of former soldiers who turned criminal, while the second are all professional criminals to start with. The heists are very different, with the reboot taking more of a crime movie slant. The original characters, aside from Ocean, are completely different as well, including their names and backgrounds. Still, I think that Soderbergh managed to make the better film here. The original film meanders a lot and takes a lot of time getting to the point. The 2001 remake is very focused, showing us why Ocean recruits every member of his crew, and then on the heist itself and what goes wrong. I mean, everything is detailed. Also, despite the huge cast in the reboot, I got the feeling I knew who they all were. You really don't with the original, aside from the Rat Pack. The reboot takes a much different stance from the 1960s version, but the result is a stronger and much more focused heist film.
2001's Ocean 11 is a masterpiece in its genre, in my opinion. I've watched it and its sequels at least 6 or 7 times. This was a case where the reboot really made the original look like shit by comparison. But you have another film that not only surpassed its predecessors, but saved an entire franchise from an abysmal fate. Tell us about Batman Begins, Steve.
Certainly. That was the case of a good movie being rebooted into something even better. Sometimes time and circumstances make the reboot more viable. When we're looking at Batman '89 and Batman Begins, both are really good Batman films that came along at the perfect time. When Batman '89 came out, the character was still trying to escape the shadow of Adam West. Still, the movie changed the way we thought of Batman between Tim Burton's vision and Michael Keaton's masterful performance as Batman. It's a movie where its flaws have become more noticeable over time, but in 1989, it was a revolutionary film. Likewise, when Nolan remade Batman Begins, it was dealing with a different problem, overcoming the terrible Schumacher films and trying to make Batman respectable again after it fell back into camp.
You brought up the 2 points that made and destroyed the Batman franchise, escaping escaping Batman '66. Batman '89 worked so well as and was a revolutionary film because it strayed away from the campy, ridiculous Adam West Batman. When Schumacher did the 180 and brought us right back to that and ran it into the ground, I might add, I wasn't sure that Batman could be dug up again. But boy, was I wrong, because Batman Begins was effing amazing. Once again, I fell in love with the character Batman thanks to Nolan.
Oh, agreed. This was a case where the audience had moved on from campy Batman, but Hollywood hadn't moved on, and they hadn't quite figured it out by that time. By the time that Christopher Nolan came on board, I think the time was right for The Dark Knight to come back after the franchise lost its way trying to replicate Adam West. Like Burton before him, Nolan was the man with the right vision for the character at the right time. And in both cases, we got a revolutionary Batman when the character needed the boost. The right director showed up at the perfect fine time, and the franchise was better off for it.
Well said, and I will add that its sequel, The Dark Knight, is one of the best sequels of all time. But sequels are a whole other discussion, and we don't have time for that. Let me jump into an example of a reboot that was desperately needed on many levels, and that is the 2012 film called Dredd. But before we get into how friggin' amazing that movie was, I have to mention its 1995 predecessor, Judge Dredd, starring Sylvester Stallone, in what is, at the very least, one of his worst roles of all time. But when I first saw Judge Dredd, I had no idea about the comic at all. I'd never even heard of 2000 AD. So I had no basis of comparison to know just what kind of crap we were getting with that film. It had some good story points and some decent action scenes. For all of its faults, it got me into Judge Dredd. Now, I'm not the biggest Judge Dredd fan out there, but I do have a lot of love for that universe and Judge Dredd Anderson specifically. But since getting into comics and rewatching Judge Dredd, I can't stand it now. Stallone's acting in particular really gets on my nerves. I did not like his portrayal of Dredd even a little. It was over the top and cheesy, which took away the hard and gritty edge of Joseph Dredd. And in both mine and many others' opinion, the film just didn't get the universe. It's like they had similar ingredients and the source material, but the dish just ended up being an entirely different meal. However, 17 years later, 3 people came along that just flat out got it. Of course, I'm talking about 2012 Dredd director Pete Travis, writer-producer Alex Garland, and the amazing Carl Urban as the great Judge Dredd. Everything about Dredd was spot on to what I've read in the comics by 2000 AD and IDW. Mega City 1 and its mega blocks are hard, dark, gritty, and violent, and it takes a judge who can give better than he's given to police them. It takes Judge Dredd. That is so personified in Carl Urban's performance, which was pretty impressive considering we only see the bottom half of his face. But even the way he carried himself was exactly how I pictured it in my mind. But he wasn't the only person to nail his role in that film. I got to bring up Olivia Thirlby as Cassandra Anderson, soon to be Judge Anderson of Psy Division, and Lena Headey as Madeline Mama Madrigal. This adaptation of Judge Dredd universe is a comic book movie that is one of the closest to the source material while doing something original. No other comic book adaptation that I'm aware of, outside of like maybe the Daredevil Netflix series, is really this faithful and true.
Oh, yeah. Dredd is easily the best film to date featuring that character, vastly better than the Stallone version. Now, I love Sly in many other things, most notably First Blood and the Rocky films that I've seen, but his take on Dredd was laughably bad, and I couldn't take it seriously. I still can't. I can't tell you how many times I've laughed at his version of "I am Dredd" over the years. And like you, I'm not someone who's read a lot of Judge Dredd, and even I knew that this movie was off. I did read some 2080 later, and I'm mildly familiar with some of John Wagner's version of Dredd now, but it just underscored how off the movie was tonally. Judge Dredd can be funny, but when it is, it's the scathing and satirical British humor. This movie was more in the American style of comedy, and that just doesn't work for Dredd. Now, the Dredd remake was a vast improvement and much closer to what Dredd should be. I agree with you. Karl Urban is an outstanding Dredd. I've said on other shows that I've done that Urban is great in just about everything he does, but he really got the character of Dredd. The Dredd-Anderson dynamic was very well handled, and we see those characters grow over the course of the film. We see Anderson learning how to act like a trained judge, and Dredd learns to accept Anderson and respect her as a judge and a partner. Mama Madrigal is a really great villain in this movie, too, and Lena Headey excels in villainous roles. I mean, she's Cersei Lannister, so, I mean, you're always going to get something great from her. Everything just comes together in this film as it should, and I agree, Dredd is one of the great comic book movies. But not every reboot quite understands that, unfortunately, does it?
No, Steve, they don't. In fact, we've talked a lot about some great examples of doing a reboot right, but there are definitely some examples of doing it very wrong. More specifically, examples of some that were just not necessary or wanted. The original was perfect in its place and time and could not be improved upon. A prime example of this for me has to be 1999's The Blair Witch Project. Because of the studio's clever marketing, there was this air of mystery about the Blair Witch Project as to whether it was actually found footage or not. Not knowing this for certain made the original film utterly terrifying to watch because it was just filmed and acted exactly how you would imagine such footage to be like. I remember being so scared after watching it that I had to immediately put on Happy Gilmore to shake it off. But the problem is that you can only fool an audience like this one time. Once it all came out that it was just indeed a movie and the whole effect of the film was just deflated, which begs the question why Lionsgate thought doing a 2016 film, Blair Witch, was even a good idea. It wasn't shot the same way as far as found footage is concerned, but rather like a regular movie, and the novelty of the first film could not be repeated. I will give 2016 film this. It had a couple of cool special effects, but it was like trying to make someone laugh by telling them the same joke again. It's just not going to get the same reaction.
No, not at all. I'm not sure why you would reboot the original Blair Witch in the first place. It's a masterpiece of the found footage genre, as you say, and it's not a trick you can repeat. Not to mention that found footage films had gradually lost their luster by that time. The odds are against a good film coming out of Blair Witch reboot to start with. That's just very, very strange. But if you want to talk about unnecessary reboots, let's talk about Total Recall. To be fair, neither of these films is really that faithful to Philip K. Dick's original short story, which is called We Can Remember It For You Wholesale. Still, the 90s version took the basic idea and built something unique and trippy out of it. It works on the action movie level with Arnold doing what he does best. At the same time, the movie works on the subtext level, and you're never entirely sure if any of what happened is real or not, which I love about that. The 2012 reboot doesn't really add anything to the formula or do anything memorable with the concept. And worse, it relies on nostalgia from the original. It even uses character names from the 90s version while completely changing things unnecessarily. There is no focus on Mars at all, as just one example. There's also no point where you can really question the reality of anything that's going on. And after you've seen it, there's no reason to care. I will say that in the reboot's defense, that the cast is excellent. Bryan Cranston, Kate Beckinsale, Bill Nighy, John Cho, and Jessica Biel are not the problem here. The problem is that this movie has no reason to exist. It isn't fun to watch, even in a cheesy action film way, and it adds nothing to what was there before. The original is much better, and it still holds up now, while the reboot today is largely forgotten, and it's been, what, almost 10 years?
I I hated the reboot. Total Recall is actually my third favorite Arnold movie, and it was done absolutely perfectly back in 1990. Besides, as you said in so many words, they butchered the characters and the story. In my opinion, this falls into the category of messing with something sacred.
Yes, definitely. And I will admit I was mad when I walked out of the theater the first time I saw it, and that was probably why. While there are movies you can make changes to, Total Recall is one you really shouldn't try to mess with unless you know what you're doing. And this film, unfortunately, didn't.
No, it did not. But guys, that about wraps up our time for the era of the remake and reboot. What do you think about our definitions for the remakes and reboots? Do you have any examples to share with us? Because we'd love to hear them. You can reach out to us directly on Twitter at Omen Revelations, or check out our poll below if you're listening on Anchor.